Let's sing all three verses. 566. If you would listen sometimes, Mike. Start that tape over, Corey. Don't film. Okay, Miss Gail. Father, I adore you. Lay my life before you. How I love you. Jesus, I adore you. Lay my life before you. How I love you. Spirit, I adore you. Lay my life before you. How Thank you for that good singing.
All right, we will be in Psalm 9 this evening. Psalm 9. While y'all are turning there, anybody got a word of testimony or something good that's happened this week? We always talk about prayer requests, but sometimes it's good to just be mindful of good things that have happened. Yes, we like those. We were. Well, I thought they didn't really need one. Everybody kind of got the point. I was actually thinking of something. This morning we were reading through. We're kind of taking a parable in the mornings with the girls, and we got to the one where the man found the treasure in the field and went off and sold everything he had to go get it, and that's what I was thinking about. I was like, you know. I was just thinking, the guy found something. He was looking, of course, the story is a little different because, you stumble upon the parable. In the parable, he just stumbles upon something, finds something. It's kind of like salvation, but I was trying to make a connection. You just didn't give me enough time. Yeah. Yeah. All right, any other word of, praise, or we will get to our prayer.
One of our former members, I'm excited about this, Gretchen Barnett Sullivan, delivered 7 weeks early, and the baby is healthy. It's 4 pounds, 9 ounces. And she's probably, that's her cousin. Nothing to me, but we love that girl, and they moved the letter to another church.
7 weeks early, wow. Good. That's always a stressful thing. It's good. All right. my youngest two kids have made almost 4 days in a row at school, so I'm real excited about that. The last 2 weeks I have been stuck at home with them, and they don't get busy work. It's like they're really trying to. I mean, bless their heart, the school district, they're trying to do the best they can. They really are. But I'm gonna be honest. That's more stressful than anything I've done. Is just trying to make sure they're doing what they need to be doing, and I'm glad they are at school. So let's just. Hey, I'm no longer a teacher. All I can say. I keep saying I'm so glad I'm not teaching right now. All right, Psalm 9. Anyway, we're devolving our conversation. All right, Psalm 9 is another psalm of David. The emphasis here is on praise, especially for the care of the people of Israel. Specifically, the care of God towards his people in Psalm 9 is directed towards his judgment on the other nations, okay? Now, we want to be real clear when we think about the Old Testament, especially in regards to Israel. We don't want to try to make too many parallels today to Israel because Israel is Israel, all right? Some of the worst theology I've seen is just trying to make a connection like somehow America is the new Israel. We're not. We're just one of the other nations, right? If you wanted to make any kind of connection, really, we probably ought to start looking at Babylon because we're just as evil as anybody else. Now, is God's grace towards us in a different way than some? Yeah. I mean, you look at our nation's history. But Israel was completely special. I mean, that's God's chosen people, right? If anything, the church is God's chosen people now, right? But we do, when we think about a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament, it's clear that God loved Israel specially, right? Like differently than everyone else. And Psalm 9 is just one of those examples where we see God loved his people, but he judged everybody else, all right? And so the theme here is judgment, but the theme is also how David saw God's judgment on other nations and praised God for it. That seems a bit harsh, doesn't it? Okay? But we just have to understand that things were a little different there. Not that God was different, because the God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. God doesn't change, right? We do. But God revealed himself a little differently then. And so the emphasis here is on praise, especially of God's care and protection for Israel, but also on his righteous judgment on the nations. You will always see the theme of judgment and justice throughout the Old Testament. They go together. Okay? Justice and judgment almost always go together. Because if you don't judge wickedness, how can you really have justice? Right? That's one of the things we see today in the law system, right? You ever see someone that just did not get any kind of judgment towards them even though they were guilty? Well, sometimes that can be justice, but a lot of times that's not justice. They go together. Okay? Also, I would say that in Psalm 9, you see a really good parallel in Isaiah chapter 25. Some of the same words there are used. And I'm going to read that. It's Isaiah 25, 1 through 5. It says, O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things, plans formed of old, faithful and sure. For you have made the city a heap, the fortified city a ruin. The foreigner's place is a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, strong peoples will glorify you. Cities of ruthless nations will fear you. For you have been a stronghold to the poor, a stronghold to the needy in his distress, a shelter from the storm and a shade from the heat. For the breath of the ruthless is like a storm against a wall, like heat in a dry place. You subdue the noise of the foreigners as heat by the shade of a cloud, so the song of the ruthless is put down. In Isaiah 25, we see that God judges the nations and exalts Israel, but the point is not exalting Israel. The point is that when God judges everyone, people realize how powerful God is. That's the point, okay? So even in Psalm 9, David is very thankful that God's protected his people, but the point really is not on God doing things for Israel. The point is that Israel's God is the one that's in control. Does that make sense? That's kind of the focus here, okay? Also, if you were to look at your little subheading, Mine says, to the choir master, according to the Muth Laban. Muth Laban means death of a son, and I have no idea how it connects. All right? No idea. I don't know if this was, some people think that maybe this was a theme that goes before this that David's just picking up on. I don't know. I mean, it could be that David wrote this after his son died, but it doesn't really connect at all. I have no clue, but that's just what it means. All right? So sometimes those are obvious connections to the psalm, but this one, I just don't understand why he named it that. But that's what he named it, and that's what it means. All right? So let's look at verses 1 through 8 first. Okay? Chapter 9, verses 1 through 8. I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I will recount of all your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before your presence. For you have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne, giving righteous judgment. You have rebuked the nations. You have made the wicked perish. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. The enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. Their cities you rooted out. The very memory of them has perished. But the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for justice, and he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the peoples with uprightness. All right, the first kind of thing you see, in verse 1, I will give thanks to the Lord. I will recount all of your wonderful deeds. What he's going to do is do that. He's going to recount God's wonderful deeds. All right? That's why every now and then I'm going to say, anybody got a praise? Something good. That's a good thing for us to consider. We pray a lot. We ask things, and there's nothing wrong, even materialistic things. There's nothing wrong with those things, right? Those are things that we see in Scripture. But it's also good for us to recount the good things that God has done, even when something may be materialistic. Well, you see that in the Psalms. You see how God takes care of his people, right? And so he's going to recount his wonderful deeds, the Lord's wonderful deed. And the first thing we see is kind of personal praise. This is personal praise. And the personal praise he is given, David is that God has saved him. Okay? Notice it says, I will be glad and exult, right? But he says, verse 3, when my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish. Okay? This is him saying, this is what God's done for me. He has saved me from physical harm. Okay? He saved me. David is going to offer, wholehearted praise to God for delivering him and his army from his enemies. However, David's point here is not to say, look at me. It's to look at God. Right? Notice, I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name. This is what he is doing because of what God's done for him. God has saved me. Therefore, let me just tell everybody how good God is. That's the point. David's point was not look at me and look what happened. His point was look at what God did. And there's a difference there. Does that make sense? That's a good way for us to look at life. His personal joy was not in him being saved. His personal joy was in God who saved him. Right? So, the point, I think, or a point, is that when we look at our life, we don't need to get so wrapped up in our circumstances so much. We need to be more mindful of what God's doing through them. That could also mean, bad things. Difficulty, trials, suffering. Those are not meant as for us to look back and say, oh, why me? It's really meant for us to push closer to Jesus. And we can grow in those moments. We may not see it here, but it may be 10 years from now, right? I was talking with someone today. They lost a child a long time ago and had an opportunity to deal with a friend who lost a child. We never want to lose a child, but through that, you have an opportunity later on to minister to someone. That's something I won't be able to minister. I will do my best to minister, but I don't identify with that as much as they would. Does that make sense? So those suffering moments and those difficult moments are still making us push closer to Jesus, and maybe one day we get an opportunity to use those. David's joy is in Jesus, not in the victory, but the God who gave the victory, okay? David describes the victory really from 3 to 6, and notice they're basically all past tense, okay? You have rebuked the nations, you have made the wicked perish, you have blotted out. So David is recounting something in the past that's helping him today, right? That's why we need to remember things that God has done. That's a great thing we can do with our children, right? It's just, when, you're teaching them or helping them out, or even as they get older, they get married or whatever, how many times do we have an opportunity to say, well, you know what? I was in a similar situation, and this is what God did, right? Past tense movements of the Lord can help us in the present, right? Or they should, right? Especially if we can look at them that way. God turned the enemy back, and in their dramatic retreat, they stumble and they perish before God himself. Okay? Why does God do this? Anybody want to say, well, why would God do that for David? I'm asking you a question. What do you think? There's one big theme, really, that connects. Why would God do something like that specifically for David?
Because the lineage of David was for Christ.
Right? That's part of it. But before that, it's the covenant, right? God makes a covenant with David, says, I will be your God. I will never leave you, I won't forsake you, I'm all in. And because God can be trusted, God will protect him always, and eventually, yes, if David dies from his enemies, Jesus is never born, right? And the only reason he's born is not because David, it's because God made a covenant with him. And again, when we think about life, God can always be trusted, people. We can't. But for some reason, because of God and his love and his grace and his mercy and his kindness, even though we are not faithful, God is always faithful to us. And that's the point. That's why David can trust the Lord today. Another point is God in verse 5, you have rebuked the nations, you have made the wicked perish, you have blotted out their names forever and ever. Rebuking is a characteristic of God. God does rebuke. Okay? I talk about this a lot. Is God love? Absolutely. But is God only loving? No, he's not. God is holy. He's just, right? He's jealous. We see God be vengeful. We see God judge. We see God execute judgment. Like God has other characteristics, and all of those other characteristics are equally a part of God. Okay? So we don't want to just focus only on God being loving, because if we focus only on God being loving, we miss out on the big picture of who God is, right? He here is rebuking the nations because he is angry at them. The word there, to blot out, really means to destroy. And it's not just destroy the person, it's to attempt to destroy every mention of that person. It's to try to erase them, basically, is the point. And that's what God says he is doing. God's name and Israel's name on the opposite side of being blotted out are going to last forever because of Jesus. Right? There's a reason Israel's still around, folks. Right? There's a reason. I mean, and when we think about it, we like to think, our nation's not very old if you think about it. Israel's been around for several thousand years, right? We're actually a relatively young country, right? Israel has a part to play even in the end times, right? I mean, we can have different debates of what all that's going to look like, but God's name won't be blotted out. Their name is, okay? So personal praise we see from David is that God has saved him. Now let's look at verses 9 through 9 through 20 is the last verse, right? Yeah. All right. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Sing praises to the Lord who sits enthroned in Zion. Tell among the peoples his deeds. For he who avenges blood is mindful of them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me. O you who lift me up from the gates of death, that I may recount all your praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. The nations have sunk in the pit that they made. In the net that they hid, their own foot has been caught. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment. The wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. The wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord. Let not man prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men. The second kind of principle we see is that David does sing national praise here, okay? Because God has protected and sheltered his people. The focus here, from 9 on, now centers on the people of the nation, people of the land, right? Who David calls several things. In verse 9, he says they are oppressed. In verse 12, he says they are afflicted. And verse 18, he says they are needy. These are the characteristics, he says, of his people. They're oppressed, humble, they're poor, they're needy, they're afflicted. They're all of these different things. And so when we consider that this is directed towards nations that are oppressing Israel, okay, because that's what's going on in the context here, we need to understand that there really are people that are faithful to the Lord that are being persecuted by the nations. We don't have to go very far to see that, okay? Over the last 5 years, the church has grown the fastest in Iran and Afghanistan. And a very large portion of the church in Afghanistan has systematically been destroyed over the last month. That's just real life, okay? In Iran and Afghanistan, it will cost you to be faithful. And a lot of those folks stayed in Afghanistan. A lot of the church leaders that we were able to communicate with, a lot of them stayed there knowing what was coming because they were personally threatened. We know you, we know where you live, we're going to kill you. And they said, we'll be right here, right? Those things happen. Now, we get bent out of shape over all kind of stuff. We won't come because the air conditioning's not the right temperature. The color of the carpet's not what we want. I mean, just fill in the blank with something petty, right? These people's like, well, you know where I live. I'll be right here praying for you. Like, these people were all in. So we know that we've seen things like this. Faithful worshipers of the Lord have been persecuted and abused. And I suggest, even in America, that if we don't start teaching young people that they're going to have to suffer, they won't. Okay, because it's coming, right? You just need to be aware that suffering is going to come for us. We're not special in that regard. We do have some great things that through our government and the way we have been established that we do have a lot more protections than other people, but one day that's going to come, whether it's for my kids or my great-great-great-grandkids. So we need to prepare people for suffering. But David here is saying in the midst of suffering, God was good. Right? Now, for him was that God protected him and took care of him. For the people in Iran and Afghanistan who may lose their life for it, God still was in the midst of that. In fact, the book of Hebrews say that people that die for their faith, the world's not even worthy of them, right? And so those people that, even talking to a guy that was talking to some missionaries on the field about 3 weeks ago in Afghanistan, that all they asked was just pray that we stay faithful. I just want you to think about that. Like, imagine being at home, your country's in turmoil, people are coming to kill you, and they just say, pray that we're faithful. Pray that we die well. Right? That's why those folks get kind of close up to Jesus in heaven, because they get a special seat if you read Revelation, right? So David praises the Lord for his faithfulness in caring for his people. We see three different pictures here of God, too. In verses 9 through 10, we see that God is called a stronghold. Okay, he's a stronghold. Because of that, God will not forsake him. Okay, during David's years of exile, running from Saul, and he found the wilderness to be actually like a stronghold. The reason David could be in the wilderness and see it as a stronghold, not because of where he was, but because of the God that was with him. Does that make sense? So we can have a stronghold no matter where we are in Jesus. Not because of our circumstances. If our circumstances is our stronghold, we'll always be let down because circumstances can change. If your health is your stronghold, it'll change. If your 401k is your stronghold, if your job's your stronghold, if your spouse or your children or anything else, if that's your stronghold, you're going to always be let down. But David says, my stronghold is you, right? So he's a stronghold. In verses 11 really through 17, God is, in verse 12, he who avenges blood is mindful of them. God is an avenger there, right? Which I think means for us that God will not fail us, okay? In other words, look at it this way. God was the one that fought Israel's battles, right? And since God was the one that fought his battles, the people of Israel should know, David knows at least, that God's not going to fail to hear them. God's the one that's going to war, right? God does fight our battles, and that doesn't mean that we don't have an active role in those, okay? I think some people think that because God fights our battles that we don't have to be prepared, or we don't, you know what I mean, like well, I don't have to do anything. Well, no, you probably ought to read the scriptures and pray, and there's things that we should do in trusting the Lord to fight our battles, right? But also know that because God was the avenger in these verses 11 through 17, the point is that Israel was supposed to use that to tell everybody else or to show everyone else, this is who God is. Our God is the one that fights for us. It's not us and our strength. I mean, if you look at Israel today, Israel's not a big country, are they? They're not. They're not a numerous country population-wise either. But they're still around, even though they're in the midst of a region surrounded by everybody that wants to kill them. You can't tell me that in some way that's not still kind of at work a little bit, right? So make no mistake here, when God is the avenger, it also means he has all the evidence that he needs to find and execute judgment on the evildoers. Okay? I don't want that to sound harsh, but I guess there's really no other way to do that. We need to understand that one day God's going to execute judgment, and that every evil thing that's ever been done, God will judge himself personally. That means all things that have been hidden will come to light. Everything, just think about unsolved murders and evil things that we just don't. God knows, and God's the avenger, it says, and he knows everything. But that also means that we need to make sure that we're in Christ, or we're going to be just as equally judged for all our sin, right? That all sin separates us from God, no matter how small or how big, right? So we need to make sure that we're in Jesus, right? And then we see God as really more as kind of like a conqueror. If you look at 18 through 20, arise, O Lord, let the nations be judged before you. That means that when God judges, he's the last one standing, basically, right? That's the point. In fact, if you look at verse 19, arise, O Lord, let not man prevail. The word there for man is enosh, which means weak or frail man. I think David's using that kind of as a play on words here, making sure we recognize we are all just weak and frail before the Lord, right? And where did Adam come from? Where was he created from? The dirt. Where do we go? The dirt. I think David's kind of making a play on that. He's saying, one day God is going to put all the rebels, all the evildoers, all the enemies in their rightful place, and they'll basically realize that they're just dust. But so will we be if we're not in Jesus again, right? And so David sings national praise, but he doesn't sing national praise saying, look at my country. He's saying, look at the God of my country. Look at him. And that's the point. But again, I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I will recount of all your wonderful deeds. That's a good thing for us to consider in our life, remembering who God is and what God's done for us, right? God is so good. He's better than we deserve. If we really had eyes to see all that God did for us, and if we were to, take the time to recount them, could we actually do it? We couldn't, because that's how good God is towards us, and that's what David is saying, and that is Psalm 9 this evening. But then Psalm 10, David kind of seeming to be in one of his bipolar moods. God, where are you? God 9, God, you're everywhere. Look at all the good stuff you've done. Psalm 10, God, are you even listening? And that's kind of real life, isn't it? Sometimes we feel like both, and so we'll talk about that next week. All right, let's go over our any prayer requests or prayer